Judge Richard Walker sat behind his imposing oak desk, the gavel resting on his right hand. The room was cool, the air thick with the musty smell of old books and paper. His black robe hung like a shadow around him, his gaze hard and unblinking. As he surveyed the courtroom, the faces of the people before him were blurred in his mind. He saw them not as individuals, but as cases, each one a number, a symbol of their failure to abide by the law he had served for over 30 years, a man of routine, a man of rules, a man who never wavered. The doors to the courtroom creaked open, and Angela Thompson stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She was dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue dress, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She had a quiet confidence about her, an air of dignity. She built a successful business from the ground up in a city where few black women had ever made it far enough to be recognized, much less respected. But in this room, she knew her power meant nothing here. She was just another person standing before the law. Angela had never been in Judge Walker's courtroom before, but she'd heard the stories of his harsh rulings and his disdain for those who couldn't afford the best lawyers, who didn't know how to play the game. She'd come in today, not with a lawyer, but with nothing but her own words, her own knowledge of the situation that had brought her here. She didn't have time for a legal battle. She had a business to run, a team to support, but still she found herself here facing the man whose very reputation for severity sent shivers down the spines of those who walked through these doors. Judge Walker's eyes met hers as she stood at the podium, and for a moment his lips curled into a tight smile. He knew she was one of the many who came before him in a long line of cases waiting for their punishment. No doubt she had no idea the full weight of the legalese that would be tossed her way. He had dealt with people like her before, small business owners trying to skirt the law because they thought they were above it, but they never got away with it. Not in his court, not on his watch. Angela began her case, calmly explaining the zoning issue that had led to the fine. She had tried to comply with the regulations, but due to some bureaucratic oversight, the paperwork had been delayed. She had only just received the notice about the fine and was now hoping for some leniency. She had no intention of trying to excuse her mistake, but she asked for understanding as a small business owner in a city that didn't always make things easy. Judge Walker didn't seem to be listening. His eyes remained fixed on her, but his mind was already drifting. He had heard enough excuses today alone to last a lifetime. He interrupted her sharply, telling her that the law was the law, and there was no room for mistakes. It wasn't his job to show compassion, not when rules were being broken. The words felt like a slap to Angela's pride, but she held her ground. She wouldn't back down. She had come here for justice, not sympathy, and if that meant a fight, then so be it. With a sharp motion, Walker slammed his gavel down, delivering the verdict, a hefty fine to be paid within 30 days, and no exceptions. Angela's heart sank, but she stood tall, nodding her head in acceptance, not because she agreed with the ruling, but because she had no other choice today. She had been reminded of the brutal truth she had always known in this world. Power didn't just come from wealth or influence, it came from the ability to control the system. As Angela turned to leave the courtroom, she caught Walker's eyes one more time. He hadn't even looked at her as an equal, but she knew one day that would change, and she would be the one handing down the judgment, not him. Angela Thompson had always been a woman of dual lives, one in the public eye and another in the shadows. By day, she was the owner of a small but thriving bakery, a staple in the local community that had become known for its unique twists on classic recipes. But by night, she studied relentlessly. She had poured herself into legal books, attended late-night webinars, and enrolled in online law courses. What had begun as a personal pursuit of knowledge soon became an obsession. Angela was determined to not just survive in a world that didn't always make room for people like her, but to change it. For years, she'd been both businesswoman and student, keeping her aspirations hidden from the majority of those around her. She'd faced enough skepticism as a black woman trying to thrive in the business world, and the idea of her shifting gears toward the legal system felt almost too much to handle. But Angela had learned how to walk through the world as if she didn't care what people thought, even though it stung every time someone underestimated her. And now, all her sacrifices, all those late nights and early mornings spent studying legal precedents and courtroom strategies, were starting to pay off. Angela had quietly completed her law degree through a mix of online classes and self-study. A few months ago, she had passed the bar exam on her first attempt. That was the easy part. The harder part had been navigating the political and professional minefields of local government, where favors were traded and opportunities were given to those with the right connections. Angela didn't have the luxury of powerful friends or family to pull strings, so she'd done it the old-fashioned way. Hard work, patience, and an unwavering belief that she belonged. The appointment had come as a surprise, but it was one she had worked toward for years. A small claims court judge in her city had stepped down unexpectedly, and Angela's name had been put forward by a progressive councilwoman who had noticed Angela's advocacy for legal reform in her community. Angela had to fight for that appointment, submitting her credentials over and over again and enduring long interviews where people asked her if she thought a businesswoman could truly understand the law. But in the end, the committee had voted in her favor. Angela's first day on the bench had been surreal. She had walked into that courtroom filled with the same mixture of anticipation and trepidation she felt when she opened her bakery for the first time. She had worn a sharp suit instead of a chef's apron, and instead of facing a line of customers, she faced a lineup of cases, most of them people from her own community. People who didn't have much, people who, in another time, she might have stood beside as they navigated the world's rougher edges. But today, they stood before her as those seeking justice. Her colleagues quickly took note of her demeanor, calm, collected, and fair but firm. She didn't have time for political games or favoritism, and her decisions were calculated with a sharp mind, not influenced by personal biases or connections. Angela was determined to prove herself, not just for her own sake, but for the people who had never seen someone like her in the courtroom. Someone who understood their struggles, but also understood the importance of upholding the law. She made a name for herself as someone who didn't take shortcuts, who gave everyone a chance to explain their side, but who didn't hesitate to make tough decisions when necessary. And it wasn't long before the news of her steady hand in the courtroom spread through the local legal community. Her fair but unwavering rulings gained her respect, and as her reputation grew, so did her power. But Angela hadn't forgotten the moment she had stood in Judge Walker's courtroom, humbled and unfairly judged. Her success now was not just about her. It was a quiet promise to herself that one day she would stand at the head of a court and change the way things were done. And fate, as it often does, was beginning to lead her to that moment. The day Angela received the notice that she would be presiding over a high-profile case involving a judge's alleged misconduct, she felt a strange mix of pride and dread. This was a case of great significance, one that would test her judgment and the integrity of the legal system. But there was one catch. She was not just any judge, and the case was not just any case. The judge at the center of the investigation was none other than Judge Richard Walker, the very man who had fined her weeks earlier. Angela sat at her desk, reading through the court documents with disbelief. She had suspected something was off about Judge Walker the moment she'd been in his courtroom. His behavior had struck her as arrogant and dismissive, especially when she tried to explain the circumstances surrounding her zoning issue. The way he had treated her, the way he had dismissed her as if she were just another inconvenience in his day, had stung. She hadn't known the details then, but now, reading the allegations in front of her, it became clear that Walker's behavior was not just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern. The case she was overseeing involved allegations that Judge Walker had manipulated rulings, shown bias in favor of wealthy clients, and misused his position of power for personal gain. Several witnesses had come forward with testimonies that painted a damning picture of the judge's actions. Angela's hands shook as she sifted through the evidence, the names of influential people who had allegedly received preferential treatment from Walker's court. This wasn't just a moral failure. It was an abuse of the very system Angela had worked so hard to be a part of. As she leaned back in her chair, Angela let out a deep breath. Part of her had hoped the system would work as it was meant to, a fair, unbiased institution. But this was a harsh reminder that the law could be twisted by those who held power. And now she was the one tasked with holding him accountable. The weight of the responsibility hit her all at once. She wasn't just a small claims court judge anymore. She was in a position to potentially change the trajectory of a powerful man's career. But this was bigger than Walker. It was about the integrity of the entire legal system. Angela knew that making the wrong decision would not only affect her career, but would reinforce the very corruption she was trying to fight against. Over the next few days, Angela went over the case file again and again. She consulted with her colleagues and even reached out to a few legal experts she trusted to get a second opinion. Despite the mounting pressure, Angela remained focused. Her decision would not be based on personal history or emotions. It would be based on the law, on the evidence, and on what was right. But she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach each time she thought about the face of the man at the center of it all. Walker's smug self-assuredness had been unmistakable when she'd been in his courtroom, and now, as she prepared to pass judgment on him, the irony hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been dismissed, belittled, and yet here she was, in a position where she had the power to make the ultimate decision. That night, as she sat at her kitchen table poring over the last of the case files, Angela's phone rang. It was a text message from a colleague, someone who had been involved in the investigation. "Angela, I don't know if you've seen this yet, but Walker is refusing to step down. He's fighting tooth and nail. He's convinced he's untouchable." Angela stared at the message for a moment. Walker's defiance didn't surprise her. It fit with the man she had come to know during their brief but charged interaction. He had never been one to admit his faults, and now, facing the consequences of his actions, he was doubling down. Angela shook her head. He had underestimated her once before, and it seemed he was about to make the same mistake again. The clock on the wall ticked louder as her decision loomed closer. Angela's resolve hardened. She would not let him intimidate her. The law was about justice, not privilege, and she was prepared to remind him of that. The day Judge Richard Walker walked into Angela Thompson's courtroom, the tension in the air was palpable. It was as though the universe had conspired to bring the two of them face to face in this exact moment. Angela sat at the bench, her robe hanging neatly around her, her demeanor calm yet unmistakably firm. She had spent the morning reviewing the case file again, every detail seared into her mind. The evidence was there. The witnesses were credible. The charges against Walker were damning. But today, it was not about the case. It was about the man sitting across from her. Walker entered with his usual air of superiority. His steps were deliberate, his face a mask of practiced indifference. He glanced around the courtroom as if he were royalty entering a throne room, his eyes scanning the faces of the lawyers, the audience, the clerk, all except Angela. He knew this was her courtroom, but he was determined not to show it. His gaze remained fixed on the floor as he strode past the defendant's table to his seat, his mind clearly already calculating how to navigate this new terrain. Angela watched him, her expression neutral, but in her mind the wheels were turning. This was no longer just about law. It was personal. Judge Walker had humiliated her in his court. He had dismissed her with a kind of smear that only men like him could get away with. Now the tables had turned. She would be the one holding the gavel, but the emotional weight of this encounter was not lost on her. "Good morning, Judge Walker," Angela said, her voice steady, but with a subtle edge that betrayed nothing. "I trust you're prepared to answer for the allegations brought against you." Walker lifted his chin, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "I've been prepared for this nonsense from the moment I heard about it. A baseless witch hunt fueled by the usual suspects who don't know the first thing about the law." Angela's gaze never wavered as she responded, her voice still calm but cutting. "The law is not about personal convenience, Judge. It's about accountability. I would advise you to take this seriously." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Walker's arrogance was legendary, but Angela had no intention of letting him sidestep the matter. He'd have been used to skirting consequences, but now he was up against a force who wasn't afraid to make the tough calls, regardless of who he was. The first witness was called, a former colleague of Walker's who had worked in his chambers for several years. The witness described how Walker had been involved in several questionable rulings, each one skewed to favor wealthy litigants. His testimony was direct and damning. Angela watched Walker closely as the details piled up. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched under the table. He was not used to being questioned in this way, especially not by someone he had dismissed as unworthy of such authority. When Angela called the next witness, a former defendant who had allegedly been manipulated by Walker's biased rulings, the atmosphere grew heavier. This was a man who had lost his business after a ruling in Walker's court had put him at a severe disadvantage. His words were measured but filled with bitterness. He had once trusted the system, but after his experience, he had lost faith entirely. "Your Honor," the man said, addressing Angela with a hint of respect in his voice. "I don't know why Walker did what he did, but I know that I'm not the only one. He's been ruining lives for years." Angela took a deep breath, her mind racing with the implications of what was unfolding. This was no longer just a case, it was a pattern that had been overlooked for too long. When it was Walker's turn to speak, he was noticeably agitated. He stood, his voice sharp as he addressed the court. "This is nothing but a political attack," Walker said, his eyes now flashing with thinly veiled contempt. "These accusations are lies. I have served this community with honor for more than 30 years, and now I'm being persecuted by a judge who doesn't know half of what she's talking about." Angela's eyes narrowed as she took in his words. There was no remorse. "I'm here to judge the facts at hand, and the facts are clear. You've betrayed the trust of this court and the people who depend on it. The law is not a tool for personal gain. It is there to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Angela thought she saw something in Walker's eyes, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, or maybe the realization that his reign was finally coming to an end. But it disappeared quickly, replaced by the same defiance that had driven him all these years. He would not go down without a fight. The courtroom fell silent as Angela prepared to hear the final testimonies. But in her heart, she knew the decision was already made. This was no longer just a matter of law. It was about breaking a system that had allowed someone like Walker to thrive unchecked for far too long. The courtroom buzzed with energy, the weight of the case pressing down on every individual in the room. Angela Thompson sat still at the bench, her fingers lightly drumming against the surface, her gaze unwavering as the next witness took the stand. It was a pivotal moment, the last witness before closing arguments. This person's testimony would either confirm or crumble the mountain of evidence Angela had been carefully building. She couldn't afford any missteps now, not when so much was at stake. The witness, a former law clerk who had worked under Judge Walker, stepped up to the witness stand. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting as he adjusted his glasses. Angela could tell that his testimony wasn't going to be easy. He was obviously torn between his loyalty to his former boss and the burden of truth. But Angela had a way of making people feel like their voice mattered, and she had a feeling this man was ready to speak up. "Mr. Carver," Angela began, her voice calm yet commanding, "please state for the court your relationship with Judge Walker and the nature of your work under him." The clerk hesitated, swallowing hard before replying. I worked in his chambers for 3 years. I was responsible for drafting some of his rulings and organizing case files. I respected him at first, but over time, I started to notice things that didn't sit right." Angela leaned forward slightly. "What kinds of things?" Carver's eyes flickered nervously to Walker, who was sitting with his arms crossed, his face set in a defiant scowl. The tension in the room was thick, but Angela's piercing gaze never left the witness. "There were rulings that seemed biased," Carver stammered. He would, sometimes, alter case outcomes in favor of certain clients, people who could afford to pay. It wasn't always about the law, it was about who had money or influence. I didn't want to believe it at first, but over time, it became impossible to ignore. Angela's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the final nail in Walker's coffin. She glanced at Walker, whose face had gone pale. The arrogance that had once filled him was now replaced with something closer to fear. The truth had finally begun to surface, and there was nowhere for him to hide. "Can you be more specific?" Angela pressed, her voice steady. Carver swallowed again, his eyes darting to the audience, the lawyers, and then to Walker. He looked as if he was holding his breath. There was this one case, a small business owner who had filed a zoning dispute, a woman named Angela Thompson. Carver's eyes flicked to Angela, then back to Walker, as if acknowledging the very reason he was here. I helped prepare the ruling for that case. It was clear to me that Judge Walker didn't want to show any leniency. We had all the facts, but he chose to ignore them. He handed down a heavy fine when he didn't need to. Angela's pulse quickened. Asterisk her case. The case that had started it all asterisk. I remember thinking it was wrong, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Carver's voice was soft now, almost a whisper. He seemed to collapse under the weight of his conscience, his guilt flooding into the room. I didn't speak out then, but now I'm here. I can't stay silent anymore. Angela felt a pang of recognition. She knew exactly what Carver was feeling. She had been there before, feeling powerless, unsure, and paralyzed by the fear of speaking out. But she also knew that in moments like this, the truth had the power to change everything. She nodded at Carver, her face softening for a moment, but she didn't let up. Thank you, Mr. Carver. Your testimony is invaluable. Angela turned her gaze back to Walker, who had stiffened in his seat. She saw the facade cracking. The man who had once believed he was untouchable was now starting to unravel, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. Your Honor, Walker said, standing up abruptly, his voice booming in the silence. This is a setup. I have been a respected member of this community for decades, and now I am being attacked by a few disgruntled individuals with personal grudges. None of these accusations hold weight. Angela's hand hovered over the gavel, but she didn't strike it yet. Instead, she spoke evenly, with a calm authority that seemed to make the courtroom hang on her every word. You may have been respected in this community for a long time, Judge Walker, but respect is not granted based on tenure or position. It's earned by upholding the law and the trust placed in you. What you have done is abused that trust, and now it's time to face the consequences. Walker's face flushed red, his breathing quickening. For the first time in this entire proceeding, Angela saw fear in his eyes. I'll give you one last chance to make your defense, Angela said. But I will not tolerate any more attempts to deflect or discredit the victims of your actions. The truth is undeniable, and I will see it upheld. Walker opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked as if he were choking on the weight of his own guilt, but he quickly composed himself. The bravado was still there, but it was no longer enough to mask the cracks that had begun to appear in his carefully constructed world. Angela raised the gavel and struck it once, decisively. This hearing is adjourned for the day. We will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. The day after the final witness had testified, the courtroom felt heavier than ever. There was an air of finality to it now. Angela could sense that everyone, from the lawyers to the gallery, was waiting for the end. The weight of the decision she would soon make pressed down on her, and though she had been resolute in her judgment so far, a part of her couldn't shake the gravity of the moment. Today would either solidify her place in history or shatter everything she had worked for. As Angela entered the courtroom, she caught sight of Judge Walker sitting at the defense table, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. The cocky bravado that had once marked his every movement was gone. His eyes no longer exuded confidence. They were clouded with desperation, the realization that his carefully crafted world was about to come crumbling down. But his pride was still there, lurking behind the facade. He wasn't ready to concede defeat, and Angela knew he would fight until the very end. The room was filled with an unusual quiet, as if the entire space had collectively drawn in a breath. Angela took her seat at the bench, adjusting her robe and placing the stack of case files in front of her. She let her fingers linger over the papers for a moment, buying time, but in truth, there was no doubt left in her mind. She knew what she had to do. Judge Walker, Angela began, her voice steady and composed. We've heard the testimony, reviewed the evidence, and examined the facts. It is now time for your defense. Walker's eyes flickered toward his lawyer, who gave him a subtle nod. He stood, pushing his chair back with an almost violent motion. The room fell silent as he adjusted his tie, straightened his shoulders, and turned to face Angela. His arrogance still simmered beneath the surface, even now when the walls were closing in. Your Honor, Walker began, his voice strained but forceful. I have spent my career serving this community with integrity. I have been a judge for over 30 years, and I have never once let personal interests cloud my decisions. Yes, I have made rulings that some may disagree with, but they were always based on the law. The allegations against me are nothing more than the desperate attempts of people who seek to undermine everything I've worked for. Angela remained silent, allowing him to finish. She had heard his rhetoric before, the same defense he had used throughout the trial. But this time, his words rang hollow. She could see the cracks in his defense, the way his hands trembled as he gripped the lectern, the sweat that had begun to bead on his forehead. You're a man who has built a reputation on rules, Judge Walker, Angela said, her voice soft yet piercing. But those rules were not meant to serve your interests, your connections, or your wealth. They were meant to serve justice. And when you manipulate the system to your advantage, you betray not only the law, but the people who depend on it. You betray the very trust this court is built on. Walker flinched at her words, but he wasn't finished. This is absurd. I have been judged by a woman with no understanding of the complexities of my career. Your decision to prosecute me is not about justice. It's about vengeance. I've been targeted for my long-standing position, and now you're trying to take it all away from me. Angela's expression remained unchanged. I'm not here to take anything from you, Judge Walker. I'm here to restore what's been lost. The people of this community, people like the business owners you've dismissed and the families you've hurt, they deserve justice. They deserve a system where the law is not a commodity for the highest bidder. And that is what I will uphold today. The room was still, the weight of her words hanging in the air. For a moment, it felt as though the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable decision to be made. Walker stood motionless, his face twitching with the beginning of what might have been regret or rage. It was hard to tell. Angela paused, her gaze unwavering. Then she turned to the crowd, addressing not just Walker, but everyone in the room. We all have a duty to uphold the law, but that duty is sacred. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how long you've been in your position or how powerful you think you are. What matters is that you respect the law and that you never use it as a weapon against those who cannot defend themselves. She leaned forward, letting the silence settle around her before adding, Judge Walker, I hereby find you guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and corruption of the very system you swore to uphold. You will be removed from your position as judge, and you will face further legal repercussions as determined by the state. There was a beat of stunned silence, the room frozen in disbelief as Angela's words rang out with the finality of a death sentence. Walker's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed as though he were about to speak, but no words came. The smug self-assuredness that had defined him for so long was gone, replaced by something raw, fear, disbelief, and the unmistakable sting of humiliation. Angela stood, the gavel in her hand. This court is adjourned, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. The gavel fell with a sharp thud, cutting through the hushed courtroom like the sound of finality. Angela Thompson's words still lingered in the air, reverberating with a power she had never imagined she'd wield. She stood tall, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. Judge Richard Walker, once a towering figure in the local legal system, sat frozen at the defense table, his face ashen, his mouth barely moving. For the first time, Angela saw him as he truly was. A man stripped of his defenses, exposed for the corruption he had carried for so long. As the court adjourned, a sense of disbelief washed over the room. People began to shuffle out, their murmurs filling the space. Some were in shock, others in awe. A few whispered words of admiration for Angela's courage, while others seemed uncertain of what this meant for the future of the local judiciary. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same. Angela remained seated for a moment, her hands resting on the bench. The weight of what she had done was heavy, but in her heart, she knew it was right. She had come into the courtroom a businesswoman, an outsider, someone underestimated and dismissed. But today, she had not just upheld the law, she had made history. Her assistant, A young law clerk named Rachel approached her quietly. "Judge Thompson," she said, her voice tinged with awe. I, I can't believe what you did in there. It was incredible." Angela smiled faintly, though the exhaustion in her eyes was evident. "Thank you, Rachel," she replied softly. "But this isn't about me. It's about the people who put their faith in the system, the ones who need it the most." Rachel nodded and glanced toward the back of the courtroom. "What do you think will happen to Judge Walker?" Angela's gaze followed, her thoughts momentarily drifting to the man who had once stood above her. She had taken his pride, his career, and exposed the truth of his actions to the world. But now, the reality of what that meant began to settle in. She had taken down a powerful man, but it was a victory born from the desire to restore integrity, not to tear someone down for the sake of power. "They'll face the consequences," Angela said, her voice tinged with the weight of finality. "But his downfall is not the most important part of this case. What matters is that we sent a message today. No one is above the law." As she spoke those words, a quiet but unmistakable sense of relief began to wash over her. For months, she had carried the weight of this decision, the responsibility of not only exposing corruption, but also reshaping the legal landscape in her city. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and humiliated. But now she had proven that justice, when fought for with integrity and determination, could not be swayed by power, wealth, or influence. Later that afternoon, Angela found herself in her chambers, reflecting on the gravity of what had just occurred. The world outside the courthouse had not changed, but inside she had made a profound difference. A new chapter had begun, not just for her career, but for the community she served. Her phone buzzed, breaking the quiet moment. Angela looked at the screen. It was a text message from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it. "Angela, I'm so sorry for everything that happened. I've been thinking a lot about that day in Judge Walker's courtroom. I never should have treated you the way I did. You were right all along, and I want to make things right. Can we talk?" Angela's fingers hovered over the phone for a moment. It was a message from someone who had been in the room that day, someone she had once seen as an ally but had lost her respect for. It wasn't unusual for people in power to offer apologies when their own positions were threatened, but something in the message caught her attention. She quickly typed out a response. Asterisk, let's talk asterisk. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about retribution. It was about making sure the right things were done, no matter who was involved. If she was going to change the system, it had to start with honest dialogue, starting with herself. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Rachel again, holding a stack of papers. "Judge Thompson, there's a call from the mayor's office. They want to discuss a new initiative to review the judiciary." Angela frowned, feeling a slight twist in her stomach. She had been expecting this. It was inevitable. Power structures never liked to be disrupted, even when they deserved to be. But she had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. "Send them in," Angela said, her voice unwavering. She stood up from her desk, straightening her robe. There was no turning back now. She had made her mark, and whatever came next, she was ready for it. The next few days after Judge Walker's sentencing passed in a blur. The city was buzzing with the news, and Angela Thompson found herself thrust into the spotlight in ways she had never anticipated. Headlines screamed her name. Angela Thompson takes down corrupt judge. Outsider judge shakes up local legal system. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, desperate for her take on the case, on the future of the local judiciary, on what came next. Angela, however, remained focused. She had done what was necessary, what was right. Walker's removal from the bench was a victory for justice, but it wasn't the end of the fight. In many ways, it felt like just the beginning. The phone calls started coming in, the emails flooding her inbox. Some were congratulatory, some angry, others filled with questions. And then there was the call from the mayor's office. The mayor, a longtime ally of Walker's, had requested a meeting. Angela wasn't naive. She knew it wasn't going to be a simple thank you call. The mayor had a lot to lose, and he was known for protecting the status quo. But Angela was ready. She had seen enough manipulation and political games to last a lifetime. She wasn't backing down now. She walked into the mayor's office on a Wednesday afternoon, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders, but her posture unyielding. Mayor Carl Davies, a man in his late 50s, sat behind a massive wooden desk. His gray suit meticulously pressed, and his expensive watch screamed old money, old power. He looked up when she entered, a thin smile crossing his face. "Judge Thompson," the mayor said, his voice smooth but with a hint of challenge. "I have to admit, I didn't expect things to unfold this way. You've certainly made an impression." Angela took a seat across from him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I don't seek to impress, Mayor Davies. I seek to do what's right, and what's right is holding people accountable, no matter how long they've been in power." Davies leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers together. Of course. But you must understand, the judicial system is an intricate web. There are relationships, alliances, systems that take decades to build. Your actions have sent a very strong message, but now we must think about the long-term effects." Angela's jaw tightened. She wasn't in the mood for soft talk. And what about the long-term effects on the people who've been hurt by that web of corruption? She asked, her voice sharp. "You're telling me that decades of unfair rulings, biased judgments, and backroom deals are part of some grand system that I should just accept?" Davies' smile faltered for a moment. "I'm not asking you to accept anything, Judge. But the system is fragile. We can't just dismantle it without considering the consequences." Angela held his gaze, her mind racing. "The system is only fragile because people like you and people like Judge Walker have abused it. What I did wasn't a dismantling of the system. It was a restoration. I brought back integrity." The mayor's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Angela saw a flicker of something else, concern, perhaps, or even fear. "And what if this doesn't stop with Walker? What if you start digging into other judges, other powerful people in this city? What then?" Angela straightened in her chair. "I've never been afraid of the truth, Mayor. If that means holding more people accountable, then so be it. You can try to intimidate me, threaten me, or bury this under layers of bureaucracy, but I will not back down. Not when I know that the people who rely on this system need someone to fight for them." There was a long silence. Davies stared at her, his expression unreadable, before finally breaking the quiet. "You're a bold woman, Judge Thompson. I respect that. But be careful. The higher you rise, the more enemies you'll make." Angela didn't flinch. "If those enemies are people who are corrupting the system, then I'll make as many as I need to. But I'm not here to play games. I'm here to fix what's broken." The mayor studied her for a long moment before slowly nodding. "I think you've made your point. I'll say this, Angela. You're not what I expected, but maybe you're exactly what this city needs." She stood up, her resolve stronger than ever. "Thank you for your time, Mayor Davies, but my work isn't done here. Not by a long shot." As she left the office, the weight of the conversations settled into her bones. She knew that this victory, removing Walker, exposing corruption, was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The system was entrenched, and there would be pushback, political maneuvering, and threats along the way. But Angela Thompson was ready for all of it. She wasn't just a judge. She was a force for change.